Stefan will introduce our guest speaker. So Stefan.
A survey for quite a while, but
Too long.
aside from shopping around and finding out where things are now, he has a passion for old stuff, and it turned out it's a typical Tasmanian thing where somebody knows somebody that knows somebody, and the guy I used to work with in health physics knew Nick, and health physics is right next door to the barracks, and he was a physicist and he talked to Nick, and Nick, because he was really interested in the old stuff, chased it down. So I think, and I saw him doing this talk to a bunch of surveyors, so he's rejigged it and going to do it for a bunch of astronomy nuts.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Lovely, thank you very much. Thanks, Stephen. As you mentioned, I'm a land surveyor. I run a business in Kingston, mainly involved in subdivisions and building development and things like that. But one of my passions is old things. Yes, absolutely. That's part of history, part of what we do as surveyors. And the link to the Transit of Venus site at the Anglesey Barracks was a friend of mine who works right next door. Mentioned it to me one day, and we got involved in a bit of a archaeological assessment of the site, and I've put together what I think is hopefully a reasonable discussion about what we found. Now, bear in mind, I'm not an astronomer, and this is not a talk about astronomy as such. It's a talk about the process that they went through to establish a site and carry out the measurements that they carried out, and what we found as part of our investigations in the last few years. So, as I'm sure you're well aware, Transit of Venus, it occurs in pairs, 8 years apart, cycles of 105.5 and 112.5 years, last in 2004 and 2012, previously 1874 and 1882, next in 2017, 2117 and 2125, well past my expiry date, I'm afraid. Back in 1874, the US Naval Observatory, the USNO, mounted a series of expeditions across the world to observe the transit of Venus, and as you may well know, it was utilised at that stage for the purpose of calculating the distance of the Sun to the Earth. Now, they sent 8 expeditions worldwide. They sent them to Vladivostok, Nagasaki, Peking, the Kerguelen Islands, Queenstown in New Zealand, the Chatham Islands, the Crozet Islands and Hobart. Now, unfortunately, due to bad weather, the Crozet Islands team stayed on the ship and actually arrived in Hobart along with the Hobart or Tasmanian crew. Now, you may be aware that the Campbelltown site up at the Grange is one of the observation sites. That was not the initial chosen site. Hobart was the primary site. They only picked Campbelltown because they had a second team here and they had to do something with them, and the owner of the Grange at the time was willing to accommodate them and position their site up there. Now, to carry out the observations, they developed effectively what's prefabricated observation kits. Now, those kits came with all the equipment necessary to set up your do-it-yourself transit site. They came with specific instructions for their erection, the orientation, separation distances. They were calibrated to their own individual requirements, and they were dispatched in effectively large crates to each site. Now, this is our man, the head of the expedition to the Hobart site. This is William Harkness, born in Scotland, 1837, died in New Jersey, US in 1903. He was heavily involved with the United States Naval Observatory for many, many years. I believe he became their chief astronomer later in life. But his role here was to lead the Hobart expedition, and they arrived on the USS Sotara in 1874, along with other crew from Campbelltown. Now, they arrived in October 1874, and they quickly identified the barracks as being a suitable location for the observations. Now, there were several reasons for this. It was elevated, it was cleared, and it was available. A number of you, I'm sure, have been to the barracks before. It is relatively open, or was relatively open, until they built structures around it. And one of the reasons they chose Hobart as the observation site was the climate being quite favourable for observations during December. Now, This is Hobart. Okay. So, they set up their equipment in October 1874, and by November they had everything calibrated and were ready to take the observations. Now, on the day of the observations, the 9th of December 1874, Harkness says in his journal, now being an American astronomer, he was quite particular about keeping records, and he says that the day of observations was noted by Harkness as the heavens were black and lowering. At 10 o'clock the sky was hopelessly overcast. At 11:40 a.m. the predicted time of the first contact, not a trace of the sun was visible. There was also heavy rain for more than an hour and dense clouds until 2:30, when suddenly they began to break away. Now, as it turns out, Harkness was actually able to take some observations. He took 39 successful pictures, and from then on until February 1875 he took additional measurements at the site to assist in the determination of his location, elevation and other criteria necessary to do his final calculations. Now, our do-it-yourself observation kit. The top of the picture there, that is what they have called a standard layout of a typical American station. Now, that top image is attributed to the 1882 observations, but it's assumed to be the same or very close to the arrangements for the 1874 observations. Now we can see there, no, we've got a pointer, have we, that the separation was 40 feet between what we call the photographic pillar at the left and the heliostat pillar in the centre, and 14 feet from the heliostat pillar to the transit pier. And at the bottom there we have a photograph of the site. This is actually Anglesey Barracks, 1874, and we can match up the top arrangements generally with the lower arrangements. The building on the left, that's the photographic building, the heliostat pillar just here, and our transit building located there. Now what you might see is a covered gantry running acrossways from the heliostat pillar through to the photographic building. Now that is a measuring rod. That's how they fixed their focal length in those days. They had a rod of a fixed length which separated the heliostat from the photographic plate to the correct focal length. And that was actually manufactured specifically for that set. So obviously it's kept under a cover to shield it from sunlight and the elements, and that was what they utilised every one of those sites around the world to ensure that their equipment was set up as close as possible to being precise. And that there is a heliostat mechanism. Now, hopefully you know what one of those is, maybe you don't. It's basically a clockwork mirror, effectively. What the purpose of that was to reflect the image of the sun and the transit back to the photographic plate, which we'll get to shortly. Now, of course, the sun's moving, so in order to track the sun, they had a clockwork mechanism, quite ingenious, which slowly rotated the mirror to ensure the reflection was always directed towards the photographic plate so they could get static images. Back in those days, of course, exposure times were relatively long, so in order to avoid that lovely blur you get as the image moves across the plate, the heliostat mechanism was sufficient to ensure that that was minimised as much as possible. That's our setup on the left-hand side there. Again, from the opposite side as the previous image, we can see the heliostat pillar situated here, the mechanism beside it, and the transit building to its left. And that's the site today. And you can see in the front here what's left of the heliostat pillar at the tip of my sheet there, and the New Zealand War monument in the back, which existed at that time as well. And that there is the photographic plate. So what we had was a small hole in the exterior of the building. We'll just go back one, if I can. Here we go. Okay, so the building on the right, which is just off the image here, had a small hole through the wall which directed the image from the heliostat onto our photographic plate, which is there. And here we can see our photographic building just there with the measuring rod across the top, and the same photographic pillar situated right there up against the fence which now separates the site from the Health Department building on Ellerslie Road. Moving on to the Equatorial House, which is another structure on the site for doing observations and calculations. We see there, and we'll get on later to seeing where they sit relative to the current buildings on the site, but that's effectively sitting halfway through the current Health Department building. And after much research, wondering where it went to, and I think heard someone saying about Campbelltown, that the Equatorial House at Campbelltown is still in the garden of the Grange. The one in Anglesey Barracks is long gone, but we managed to track it down through a complete fluke. That's a photo of the Weather Bureau, which is next door, and some gentleman letting a weather balloon go in 1851, and lo and behold in the background is the old Equatorial House, which must have been shifted across the fence for the convenience of storage. It's long gone now, unfortunately. I've looked. Obviously they rebuilt the Weather Bureau building at the Ellerslie site a number of years ago, so most of that gear is now currently gone. Now, being again United States Naval Observatory, they kept incredibly good records. So every piece of equipment was photographed and provided with some detailed information about what they were and how they worked. Now you can see here, of course, each bit of equipment had its own storage box for transport, kept safe for future observations. So on the left-hand side there, the meridian instrument for observing the direction of the transit. We've got what they call a micrometrical engine, which from my fairly poor understanding is some sort of microscope for measuring minute details off the photos that they observe from the transit. Someone else here might know more than I do. Moving on to some additional equipment. Now these photos are all actually of the Hobart equipment too, so they were actually recorded and stored in America. What they call a portable chronograph. Now, I'm not sure about you, but it doesn't look very portable to me. I'm sure you can do things a lot smaller than that these days, but they were positioned inside buildings adjacent to the site at a controlled temperature to ensure that they are as accurate as they needed to be, because time was critical, of course, for their calculations. Now that is a plan of the site. Now that was prepared by Harkness in 1874, which shows precisely the location of all the features on the site at that time. Now we can see there, that's a soldier's monument. It's still there on the grounds. We saw the transit house, heliostat, and the photographic house, Equatorial House, and a storehouse on the far left-hand side there. And just above there, on that slope there, which slopes down towards Hobart, is the area which has now got the Health Department building situated on it. Now, moving forward in time. 6th of June 2012, as we may well know, was the last transit of Venus. Now, as it turns out, a friend of mine, Stephen Newbury, as we discussed, works right next door in that building back there. In early 2012, he had noticed what he assumed was just a sewage vent pipe sticking out of the ground in the grounds of the Anglesey Barracks. During his lunchtime, he went for a walk and he was astounded to find that it was actually the remaining pillar of the transit of Venus in 1874. So he contacted me and said, well, lo and behold, don't you know that the next transit is this year? So we thought it would be opportune to actually re-observe the transit from as close as we could to the location as it was in 1874. So I brought with me the latest technology, an early 1900s theodolite that I happen to have at the office. It's actually just a keepsake for interest, but it does work. So we brought that down. I've got a dark glass which was utilised in the old days for taking some observations, attached that to the device, and we observed the transit. That's actually an image up there from it on a card from, well, within about probably 10 metres of the original location. Unfortunately, again, good old Health Department, right in the way. They put their building smack bang between the observation site and where the sun was at the time the observations were occurring. So a good 36 years later, we have re-observed the transit from as close as we could possibly get from the position of the original observations. Where to from there? Well, we thought that perhaps additional investigations might be necessary. So, top there, we can see the base of the heliostat pillar. We saw that before with the mechanism and the mirror on top. And here we see the original photographic pillar, the sewer vent pipe, right against the fence. The arrows around the heliostat pillar were added later as a sort of a pseudo compass. Obviously never been its purpose, but somebody thought it was a good idea at the time. So we thought that it might be interesting to do some excavation of the site and see what happened to the old component of the observation structures. Now, being a Commonwealth site, we thought, well, we've got Buckley's chance. So we made a submission to the Commonwealth and said, we would like to dig up the middle of the barracks. And surprisingly, they said, yeah, okay. So they did. They even cordoned it off for us. You see the bunting around there. We didn't do that. They did that. And one Saturday, we decided to start digging. Now, luckily, of course, we knew exactly where to look because the US Observatory was very particular about keeping records. And we know, earlier on in the piece, that there was a standard layout of the observation equipment. So we knew exactly where to dig. We knew there was 40 feet from the photographic pillar to the heliostat pillar and 12 feet from the heliostat pillar to the transit pillar. So, using more recent technology than my old 1920 satellite, we set up on the heliostat pillar, read the angle to the photographic pillar, of course in a straight line, should be due north, and then measured 12 feet exactly southwards and then dug a hole. What did we find? Well, a big lump of stone, okay, as it turns out. So, interesting enough, as we started to dig, we started to uncover bits of debris, mortar, bits of brick, glass, bits and pieces like that. Although, interestingly enough, not quite what we expected them to be. If you look in the front here, that is where we thought it should have been, based on the standard layout of the US Naval Observatory. When we started digging, we exposed this edge here and realised we were actually too far to the north. We had to move another 2 feet south before we actually ended up uncovering the base of what we thought was the transit pillar. So we exposed that and we questioned ourselves and saying, well, is that what we were looking for? How do we know that that was the base of the transit pillar? Well, good old US Naval Observatory kept very, very meticulous records. And they say, in the excavation for the foundation of the pier for the Meridian instrument, hard rock was struck at a depth of 25 inches below the surface. Upon the rock was put a layer of 6 inches of concrete, and above that a massive rubble masonry 3 feet 6 inches square and 19 inches thick, the top of which was level with the ground. 3 courses of hammered stone followed, the first 3 inches thick, the other each 14 inches thick, and all measuring 26 inches from east to west by 22 inches from north to south. The last of these courses was surmounted by a carefully dressed capping stone measuring 24 by 28 inches and 3 inches thick. Mortar made of the best hydraulic cement was used throughout. The upper surface of the capstone was 4 feet 11 inches above the bottom of the concrete and 28 inches above the floor of the transit house. Okay, now, as it turns out, that base we found is precisely our, 26 by 22 inches, almost exactly. So we were confident we had found the base that we were looking for. Had they not provided that information, we may have been wondering, but it was exactly the same as what we believed it to be. Now, the pillars were built by a local builder, and it appears, based on what that's made of, he probably used whatever rubbish had in his builder's yard, because there's bits of small sandstone and rock and stuff all just chucked in there, but that accords pretty much, as it says, rubble masonry. So the builder just brought up his barrow and just, there we go, that's your pillar. So we knew where we were. So by doing some careful measurements, I overlaid where we believed each structure to be by measurement. So the footing of the transit pillar, the heliostat pillar, and a photographic pillar, house pillar, and overlaid it with the current imagery of the site. Now we can see there, of course, our equatorial house there, unfortunately, inside a building, so that's not there anymore. The photographic house, partly inside the health department, so that's long gone. Luckily, again, the New Zealand War Memorial is still there, so that was a reference they used to calculate where they were. And that agreed, not perfectly, but fairly closely with where we believe they should have been. And the measurements between them, 12.198, as it turns out, almost exactly 40 feet, but 4.986, which is actually about 16 feet, not 14. So there was an anomaly there. It wasn't quite matching with what the American standard layout was. And we thought about that and we thought, well, as far as the observation is concerned, as long as their transit pillar was on the same alignment, north-south, as the rest of the infrastructure, it probably didn't really matter how far it was. They weren't directly connected anyway, they didn't need to be. They just had to be on the same alignment. So we did all the calculations. I was satisfied that we had found what we believed to be the transit pillar. And in cross-section, it's been compacted a bit, bear in mind it's not actually to scale. We ended up with a layout which looks somewhat like that, which, aside from the buildings that aren't there at the moment, it was very similar to what the original layout was intended to be. Now, we came to a decision that perhaps either, as they do, the builder cocked it up and put the pillar 2 feet further south than he should have done. No, she'll be right, mate, we'll sort it out. Or the pillar was actually offset on top of the footing, so as I've shown there. So it is possible that in order to have something to stand on, they may have made the pillar larger so that they had a solid base to stand on rather than creaking around on the wooden floor. And then the transit pillar was pushed forward to ensure there was enough separation for the operator to stand. That would account for that couple of feet difference we got with the measurements. Now, what do we find? We dug a hole, and that's what we found. We found lots of mortar, probably from the construction, glass, bottle glass and window glass and other components, and slate. Now, we don't believe most of that is actually from this infrastructure. We suspect it's probably from the demolition of a building on site from many years ago. They just probably bulldozed into a heap, and that's where it stayed. A glass bottle, ginger beer maybe, and a glass stopper. That glass stopper may not have been from that bottle, but it actually was a stopper which would have fitted in a bottle such as that to ensure that it's sealed, and they were sealed with wax. Lots of brick rubble. We think that was from the photographic pillar, and lots of beer bottles. So either Harkness and his mates were somewhat bored and said, well, let's have a few more beers, or builders, as they do, what we do with those beer bottles, we'll just chuck them in the hole there, we'll be all right. Or maybe some of the local personnel at the barracks decided to have a drinking session at the top of the hill and bury it underground. So, what happened from there? Well, I wanted to investigate further. How did what Harkness claimed to have done relate to what I really found on site? Well, again, nice and meticulous. He kept very particular records about what he did on the site. He took observations to a number of features around Hobart to identify his position relative to, well, the rest of the world, and obviously to ensure that true north had been calculated. So he took reference observations to what they called the rifle butts. That's actually now Macquarie Point, okay, from the old Queen's Battery. It used to exist on that point. Prince Albert or Mulgrave Battery, just up in Battery Point, and St David's Cathedral. Now, he calculated his elevation using an observation to the rifle butts and some scaled measurements from the Admiralty chart from 1861. Now, from a very, very basic trigonometry, you might appreciate that an incredibly long, narrow triangle is inherently dangerous because it causes significant errors in your calculations.
So is that 1861 Admiralty chart?
I'll get onto that in a minute, okay? Right, okay. So how do I work out where I was? Well, it's pretty easy these days. I press a button. Simple as that. So we set up our high precision GPS on top of what is the remains of the heliostat pillar and said, where am I? And press the button. And utilising RTK GPS within 25 mil, it told me precisely where I was on the Earth's surface. That was easy, I could do that. Okay, and then obviously observing the angles between the equipment, we set up a modern theodolite, modern total station, and observed the angles between now knowing exactly where the heliostat pillar was and other reference marks around Hobart, such as Mount Wellington, their coordinated marks. We know precisely where they are on the Earth's surface, so we can calculate our direction relative to north and then confirm whether the alignment of the pillars as they calculated were truly on the alignment they were meant to be. And they were, within about 10 or 11 minutes of rotation, so they were pretty bloody good at that time. Now, bearing in mind they had adjustment on top of the plates anyway, they could have slid their equipment backwards and forwards a bit to make sure it's precise. So that 10 or 11 minutes could have just been a minor construction issue, which was ironed out when they set the gear up. Now, onto the Admiralty chart. So, left-hand side, copy of the 1861 Admiralty chart of Hobart Town, okay? And as it turns out, in the bottom corner there, up in the sheet there, enlargement of it there, that says monument. And that is, of course, Anglesey Barracks. So, we know where Harkness was supposed to be. He knew where he was supposed to be. So, he took his observations to St David's Cathedral, top left, from the barracks, where it says monument, 184 feet. Top right, Queen's Battery and Macquarie Point, the rifle butts. And the bottom right-hand corner, Fort Mulgrave, which is actually just behind the park at Battery Point. As it turns out, that's what he observed, more or less. How far was it? Well, he claims, from his ridiculous records, 1,776 feet to St David's Cathedral, 4,733 feet to the Queen's Battery mast, long gone, don't know where that was, 4,771 feet to the rifle butts at Macquarie Point, and 2,236 feet to the mast at Mulgrave Battery. Now, luckily, we can actually track most of those these days, okay? Most of those. We know where St David's Cathedral is. We know where the Mulgrave Battery flagstaff was. We know, sort of, where the Queen's Battery was at the Domain. It's actually under the cenotaph now, or partly. And we know where the rifle butts at Macquarie Point was. Now, this is where we get onto the Admiralty chart. What we measure these days and what Harkness thought he was measuring aren't quite the same. And with a bit of a quick calculation, we can fairly quickly see a very common theme occurring here. They're all out of scale by about 1.06, okay? Where's that lead us to? Well, of course, for calculating his elevation, if he's using the wrong length, of course his height's going to be wrong as well. So that's going to cause us some issues. Now, knowing where the Queen's Battery was, or more or less, we can do a rough calculation, but we really can't be that sure. How do we know where the rifle butts are, or were? Well, luckily, good old list map, state government tile system. They actually still have the boundaries of the old Macquarie Wharf, Macquarie Point shown on the mapping system. Even though, of course, it's well and truly been covered up by landfill and wharves, we actually know exactly where the point of the rifle butts was because it is still mapped. So easy, we can usually measure it within, let's say within 5 or 10 metres, so we know where we should have been. St David's, well, that's a different story actually, because Harkness turned up in October 1874. Well, actually, the month before, they actually knocked down the old cathedral. So you may know that they knocked down the old cathedral, but they had already started to build, or had already built, the new cathedral on the same site. But what was Harkness looking at? Well, of course, he must have been looking at the new cathedral, because that's what's there. They already knocked the old one down. But what was on the chart? Well, of course, on the chart, go back a couple, back to that one, back over here. That there, in 1861, of course, must have been the old cathedral, because the new one didn't exist. So what was he really measuring to? Of course, he knew what he's looking at, but how did that relate to what he thought he was measuring off the plan? And he may not have been aware that the old cathedral had been knocked down. He's American, he just turned up. He's just looking and seeing what he sees when he gets there. So that could have led to some of the confusion. Arrow through that one again. So looking at St David's Cathedral now, of course, we had two options. He said he observed the centre of the front of St David's Cathedral. Well, to me, the front is the one that faces Murray Street. That is the main entrance. But I don't know whether he could have seen that. Maybe he saw the Macquarie Street frontage. Maybe he thought that was the front. Again, he's not familiar with the area. So really, what was he looking at? As it turns out, good old Trove. There's a photo from the old St Gates's Cathedral Tower looking backwards towards the Anglesey Barracks. And you actually see under the arrow there the memorial at the top, which is pretty much exactly where he was taking his observations from. So we know that you could see from there to here to St David's Cathedral with some degree of certainty. Now, it is possible that the buildings on the left-hand side of Murray Street obscured or partially obscured the cathedral, so maybe he thought he was looking at the front and was actually looking at the Macquarie Street frontage. And here's a photo of the St David's Cathedral in 1892, and you can see quite clearly the Macquarie Street frontage there. It does look quite prominent, and that was before the spire and the tower was constructed, which I think was actually built in 1928, I think it was, after a few problems, apparently, money-wise and things falling down. So if we overlay his observations versus what we believe to be the case, as it turns out, it looks like Harkness's distance stops almost exactly, and this is an overlay of the current list map aerial photo and Sprent's book survey from the early mid-1800s, which shows you, and you can just make out there in the pink, St David's Cathedral, or St David's Church they call it there, and then above that, in the aerial photo background, you can see the current church, and they line up almost exactly. So he probably was looking at the Macquarie Street frontage, but measured to what he thought was the church, which is actually the old one, but long gone, of course. One more. The Prince Albert or Mulgrave Battery still partially exists. You can see the remains of the discoloration through there is where a lot of the abutments were, and the cannon and other infrastructure. Overlaying, good old Google, the current position of that property in the corner versus this old map on the left-hand side there. We can see that where the mast used to be, the flagstaff, is right in the backyard of number 2 McGregor Street. And as it turns out, the original Sigmund's house almost exactly matches the current house on that site with quite a bit of modification. I haven't investigated that further, but I do believe there's actually some flagstones still in the yard of number 2, which is probably the old flagstones around the mast. There's a picture at the top right of number 2 McGregor Street. Got some delightful 70s flats in it now, I believe. We can see in the bottom right here, that's Mulgrave Battery, looking back out towards, I don't know what the street is on that side, sorry, back towards Mount Nelson at least. And the flagstaff would have been over on our right. And on the top left there, a photo from Huon Road, looking back towards Battery Point. And I believe that the Mulgrave Battery would have been roughly where that red arrow is pointing down through there. Again, overlaying our observations from the transit site back to the Mulgrave Battery. Harkness claims his distance is to be 681.5 metres. Oh, it's the middle of the street really, can't quite be right. And the flagstaff position by our calculations, 718. Again, that's that scale error that appears to be creeping up in the calculations we've made between Harkness and ourselves. So, what works out after that? Well, interestingly enough, we know exactly how high the transit site is at barracks, because I pressed my magic button and lo and behold it told me precisely where I was. And if we, interestingly enough, adjust Harkness's calculations for his elevation by the exact ratio we came up with, the 1.05, within 200 millimetres of what he claimed his height to be. So I'd suggest he was actually pretty damn good. He just picked the wrong map. So, in conclusion, I think he's a pretty good surveyor actually, and astronomer. He did a good job. His north orientation was pretty damn good. His heights were pretty close. His observations of various features around the site were all pretty good, despite the 1874 equipment being, yeah, okay. Unfortunately, his reliance, rightly or wrongly, on the 1861 Admiralty chart did lead him astray. And the transit telescope pillar being 2 feet further south than we believe it should have been, well, let's just call it a bit of artist's licence from the builder's point of view.
And what are the implications with the difference in distance and all that sort of thing with the transit?
Like I said, I'm not an astronomer, so I really can't tell you exactly what the implications are, but I doubt they'll be significant. I guess that's just something they include in their calculations. Now, I would suggest that the standard layout is for convenience rather than necessarily being any mathematical purpose. Simply saying it's 40 feet and 12 feet is just convenient rather than necessarily being any particular dimension. And probably the fact that it was relatively compact and they could fit it into a fairly small space quite easily was probably the main reason.
It depended on his focal length of his lens.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and that's the reason why they did. And as we saw from the heliostat pillar, the mirror to the photographic plate was critical. That was the 40 feet, and that measuring rod that they had placed under the gantry was critical to make sure the focal length was precise. As to where the transit pillar sat behind that, yeah, it probably wasn't that important, as long as they included that in the calculations.
What sort of surveying equipment did they use?
They would have had mechanical theodolites in those days, so I don't think I've got a photo of it here, but probably not dissimilar to the one I utilised for the observation. So just a mechanical theodolite with a horizontal and vertical card in it, which observes at the angles to the nearest minute and estimates angles below that. They, provided they're well adjusted, they're accurate enough. So you can certainly read to within probably 30 seconds with some degree of certainty. Certainly most of their observations are recorded to the nearest minute, but usually you found in their observations they would identify the angles relative to minutes and fractions of a minute as a guide as to how they observed it.
We went up to the Grange in 2004.
Oh yes.
Party from the AST.
Yep.
And for the transit that day, and we saw the conical shed.
Yes, the
two pillars.
Yep.
Were used as gate posts.
Yes.
On their drive.
They are in fact out where the service station now is,
Yeah.
and they were.
When the service station was rebuilt, they took them out.
Yes.
I think they're actually in the museum.
Oh, they really are, because I'd like to see them again, because I would dare say they are identical to the ones that we hear again.
Thinner than that one.
Do they? Okay, right. Yeah. Well, I believe that the heliostat pillar was slightly smaller than the photographic one.
Yeah.
It's probably do-it-yourself transit kit for dummies, I suspect. Make everything unique and you can't cock it up, basically, I think is the way they did it. So, but they still managed to, but nevertheless, that's life.
A photograph of the two pillars.
Oh, okay, right, yeah, because that's something, leading on from this, that would be something that would interest me too, would be going up to the Grange and doing a similar thing up there, because now we know precisely where things should be. We could probably replicate that up there.
They say we're going to look for the block.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how the measurements at the Campbelltown site relate to what we found here, because they should be the same. Are they? I don't know.
Any of the photographs, like those 39 photographs you took?
Yes, they're available. Yes, so the United States Naval Observatory has a website, a library, and there are a number of those available on there. They're pretty.
They all went back to the US?
Yes, absolutely. Everything went back to the US. That's right. Yeah. So I wouldn't say they make thrilling reading or viewing. They're just a series of photos of the sun with a black dot, slowly making us great.
About 30 years to calculate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think it was a fairly slow process. Everything was done longhand, of course, in those days doing the calculations. So it took them quite some time to collate and finalise the reports. I have a full copy of the journals of the observations in 1874. The printed version, once they came back to America, they collated it and printed their version. So for every single location of the station, there is a set of tables and observations and calculations and descriptions. Hobart is the only one that particular about everything that they did, and maybe that's partly because of the person who it was. Other ones, you know, the Caribbean Islands, well, the middle of the bloody Atlantic, they're not away from it anyway.